Hi, my name is Cameron Miller. I'm with Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. And this is a reflection, it's a reflection on the readings from the 17th week after Pentecost, but also on some interesting experience. So here we are left with Jeremiah's complaint and the who's the greatest gospel. Thank goodness that there is this Balm in Gilead poem, even though it reads with the clear understanding that it may be the ashes we arise from, but there will be ashes. The gospel puts it out there. While Jesus may be concerned about his online profile and how many likes he gets, his disciples are chasing Muhammad Ali, declaring they're the greatest. It is one more way that Mark makes clear in his gospel just who we are if we, as the readers, identify with the disciples rather than Jesus. Mark knows who we are, and he doesn't try to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear like some of the other gospels do. He makes clear we are wonderful and sad, pathetic and great, spot on and really far off. His disciples, who more or less are us, never fail to try, but often fail when they try. They love greatly and sometimes not enough. They have their eyes on the prize, but it's often the wrong one. So this gospel can be a sleeping dog we let lie in the corner, and let it speak for itself, perhaps. But with that gospel in mind, I want to do a kind of a dangerous thing. I want to embrace Jeremiah's God story, and then I want to comment on something I was not here last Sunday to experience with you. That's bold, I realize, and maybe even arrogant. Surely it's unadvised. If in the process, though, I somehow deny your reality, I apologize and hope you will forgive me. Now, the lectionary was not so bold as I planned to be. It assigned that reading from Jeremiah today, and then it chickened out. It left off God's response to Jeremiah. And here's how God answered Jeremiah's complaint about the men of Anatote who wanted to assassinate Jeremiah. This is verses 21 and 23. Jeremiah sent a signal to God, who spoke up. It is God speaking. Here's what I will do to the men of Anatote who are trying to murder you, the men who say, don't preach to us in God's name or we'll kill you. Yes, it's God of the angel army speaking. Indeed, I'll call them to account. Their young men will die in battle. Their children will die of starvation. And there will be no one left at all, none. I'm visiting the men of Anatote with doomsday. There it is. Now, our quasi-liberal theological tradition, of which I'm a stepson, gets moralistic about biblical violence, especially if it's God doing the violence. To which I say, check out quasars. Do you know what black holes do? I mean, take a look at our sun, for crying out loud. S-U-N. I mean, we are a violent species. Human beings are one of the few animals that can become violent just for the sake of violence. Most other animals require survival as a predicate for violence. We'll do violence to other species, or to our own species and to others, just because we don't like them, or we don't like what they stand for. And we're going to get squeamish about God coming down hard on a little town. And just as an aside, Anatote did get turned into rubble at least once, and it also got restored. May have risen through the ashes, I don't know. But personally, I have been someone who spent a lot of time dancing around such violent-laden biblical readings, but I've learned that when I put anxiety aside and I stand with the passage and I just observe it rather than judge it, I say to myself, yeah, that makes sense. Anathoth was Jeremiah's hometown, and some men from there were trying to kill him. He wants to show them a thing or two, and he has no hometown sentimentality going on here. Call down the angel armies, smite them, doomsday. Now we are only a few days away from the 9/11 anniversary and stuttering again over that violence. And we are but a few weeks away from our retreat from 20 years of calling down drone armies to wreak violence on whoever happened to be in a spot where some Taliban soldiers were rumored to be. I don't know what an angel army looks like, but it could not be any more violent than our armies. I don't think so. And if they are, I stutter to imagine it. Now, something happened here or at our church in the tent last week when I was gone due to the violence in my back. I imagine that some of you who are listening to this weren't there either. So my reflecting on it might be a little bit weird and like the wrong thing to do. But as Katie said, I reflect on other people's experience every week. They just happen to have been dead for 2,000 or 3,000 years. The authority of the Bible, after all, is that we are the same people who gather around the altar or a table or a fire just 2,000 or 3,000 years later. They are us and we are them. So because I wasn't there last Sunday, I don't really know what happened, and I don't know what any individual did or didn't do, then like reading scripture, I got to just listen. I got to just observe what people told me. No judgment, no dog in the fight, except of course that I love you, I love this congregation, and that surely clouds my perception. So I've heard several descriptions of last Sunday when two small violences collided, but I'm pretty sure I don't have an accurate picture, only a kind of a collage of other people's experiences. So with that in mind, I'm going to go out on a limb and talk about it in the context of Jeremiah, Mark, and the balm in Gilead. My understanding of what happened was that a stranger who declared she was unmasked and unvaccinated, and everybody else should be too, interrupted the worship last Sunday to throw a word bomb inside the tent and leave. Now there were a variety of reactions to that, and they all seemed natural. And I'm guessing that in addition, there were some verbal bombs. In addition to the verbal bombs that were thrown back at her, there were also some thought bombs that never got heard. Surely there was also some shock and anger and fear and confusion and mixed feelings and double-mindedness. All of it natural, very natural for human beings. When we are attacked, and especially when we feel vulnerable, as most of us would with an unmasked and unvaccinated evangelist preaching at us, we move to protect ourselves, period. My experience with such messengers, and believe me, I've known more than a few, is that she would not have taken a seat at the edge of the tent even if it had been offered to her. And in fact, she was offered a bulletin and a seat before she spoke, but she passed up the offer. If she was the kind of messenger I think she was, the kind I have experienced in the past, she was not here to be part of a community. She was here to make her pronouncement and leave. Whether she was acting out a mental health crisis, a political militancy, fighting back against a perceived foe, or an instrument of God's weird paradoxical nature, we simply don't know. But whatever it was, surely she was acting out of her sense of powerlessness, blasting out and spewing her innards because otherwise she felt like nobody was listening. Because after all, why else would someone put themselves through that kind of rejection? I'm told she claimed to have been rejected by another church already that morning. Well, before I go on, I just want you to know I have no problem with how the congregation reacted. Some silent, some vociferous, some simply rejecting what was hurled at them, some gently marking the boundaries of acceptability for the community. Our lovely priest Michael standing there between it all and offering a gentle response rather than heightening anxieties. The fact that it came in the midst of a gospel and a sermon about who do you say that I am is just too juicy of a church happening not to mention and not to invite more reflection over. Some people have asked, what would I have done? Who knows? Like you, it would have depended upon my mood at the moment and my inner life. If my back was hurting the way it had been, I probably would have been more gruff than appropriate. And because I'm big, it would have come off as a lot more menacing than I would have meant it to be. So I want to tell you instead a story about this kind of thing that I cut my teeth on and learned a lot from, and I think is how I would like to frame what happened here last Sunday, knowing, of course, I wasn't here. I was the rector of a church on the campus of Ohio State University, an urban campus of 50,000 students and 25,000 faculty and staff. In those days, the university had basically abandoned the neighborhoods all around it, and it had become the most densely populated part of the city, with often wild and drunken university student apartments stacked up alongside crack houses and intense poverty. Street people were everywhere. It was the 1980s and 90s when states shut down their mental hospitals and abandoned their residents to the streets in the name of progressive care. So anyway, the church was and is the only non-university building on campus. The campus grew up on all three sides, and then the main meridian of Columbus was in the front. Before I had arrived as the rector of that church, the congregation had welcomed, or I don't know, the congregation of the clergy had welcomed the homeless to sleep in their parish hall, having installed huge iron grates on each end of the parish hall to keep them out of the rest of the building at night, because there was no supervision. It was another kind of, I think, liberal nightmare, just to open the place and offer no structure, no norms of behavior, no host to provide hospitality. Well, of course, someone died, and I know of at least one woman who was raped. Mercifully, the church had stopped that practice before I came, but we were still a hive of homeless characters. There wasn't a weekday or Sunday that didn't include our friends from the street. One wedding, in fact, a smart, enterprising panhandler waited for the couple to process into the church, then followed behind her, hitting up people along the aisles who were handing out 10s and 20s just to get rid of them. Good day for him. It was a pretty good wedding, too. Anyway, the church was frequented by a guy who alternately called himself Mighty Mouse and Minnie Mouse, and also Queen somebody, but I can't remember. I thought of him as kind of my alter ego because he was my size and even hairier, though at the time I had a ponytail and a beard, big beard. He often didn't wear a shirt, and sometimes painted his protruding hairy stomach. Sometimes he stood out front, which was all glass, and looked inside. Sometimes he just walked up and down the side aisles. Sometimes he came in and sat down during church. One time I walked into the parish hall before the late worship where he was standing and kind of considering something. It was the custom of that congregation that for 70 and 80-year-olds to kind of sit in a circle of about 20 or so and drink coffee together before the service. That day, my 3-year-old daughter was being passed around lap to lap, as often she was. Now, Minnie had a car radio around his neck, likely stolen. It was hanging on a clothesline, and it had a piece of wood attached to it with a wire. I asked him about the radio, and he told me that he was interviewing people. And could he interview me now? I told him I was in kind of a hurry, but he could probably go interview the folks at the table. So that's what he was doing when I exited. When I came back that way, it was obvious that he was going from person to person, interviewing them about what I don't know or remember. But I do remember that the table was non-anxious because Minnie was familiar to us, even though he hadn't always been. When he was not on his meds, he could be loud and violent. This is the way he was the first Sunday he arrived with a message from God. Long story short, because of my time working in a mental health unit, I knew not to challenge his reality, which of course none of us want our reality challenged. I listened to him deliver God's message, and then I told him that if he wanted to stay, here's how he needed to behave. He left. My experience is that even in difficult moments for such people, they often are able to judge what their own limits are. Anyway, what I learned from him, and from many other street people who visited us often there and in other congregations, was the importance of being really clear about the boundaries of the community. It's not only okay to have boundaries, it's mightily important. Our boundaries say who we are and what we aspire to be. I have no doubt that Jesus had very clear boundaries of acceptability in his community. There's no room for Christian sentimentality when it comes to being clear about our boundaries. It helps people both outside and inside the community to know what our boundaries are. In today's gospel, for example, Jesus is setting the boundaries with his community. He says that whoever wants to be the greatest must act like a servant. We're still failing that one. We're a church top-heavy with bishops, priests, deacons, and wealthy donors. But having clear boundaries is aspirational as well as practical. If you and I are not willing to live within the expressed boundaries of the community, then we need to recognize we're choosing not to be part of that community. So, for example, we here at Trinity Place say that we are open, inclusive, and challenging, and that we respect the dignity of every human being. Now, we probably need to clarify what those things mean. But we know that being inclusive does not mean welcoming people to come in, drop word bombs, and leave. We're not here to be dumped on. We need to respect one another's dignity, but we also need to insist that others respect our dignity. Period. There's nothing unchristian about tending our boundaries. We likewise need to reflect on best practices for doing that, but there is no reason to tolerate someone not honoring our dignity, or for us not honoring theirs. We need to be able to say to one another and to anyone who knocks on the door, here is how we expect to treat one another, and we would love you to be part of this community and ask that you live within our norms. We, of course, screw up from time to time because we're disciples after all. But if we can repent and return to the norms, so to speak, then the rest of us can practice forgiveness. I really hope that you don't mind my reflecting on an experience I was not part of, and that maybe you were. It just seemed too fresh and, as Michael said last week, too important for us not to reflect on further. Who do you say that I am? Who do we say that we are? And how are we going to practice that in the very rugged and precarious world that we live in? All those are really good things to ponder in the presence of Jeremiah and Jesus and the balm that comes to us from the ashes in Gilead.